Going to be doing a dust effect. Dust is reasonably simple. It's basically expanding circles. You'll have your point of origin, and then from your point of origin, you're basically going to be drawing a set of expansions. Those expansions are going to basically be circles. You're going to enlarge them and create some variations in those circles, and slowly move them away from the source of the dust. If you had a force with more velocity, it would go in the direction of the force. What you also want to have is, as it moves out, it will begin to thin out in places. And then eventually it will begin to break apart. Then I'll just drag these onto the timeline and see what it looks like. So now that I've finished my basic rough for the animation, I'm now going to ink the animation. To do that, I'm just going to create a vector level. I'm going to make the size of my brush 0. The reason I want my brush size to be 0 is so that if I render it, you'll see it doesn't actually render at all. The only color which I want to be visible for the dust is actually going to be the full color. You can do effects with outlines, and there's no problem in doing that, but it's not the effect I'm looking for with this specific effect. If we go to Preferences, and go to Visualizations, you'll see that there's an option for Show Line with 0 thickness. If we turn that off, any lines which we draw with 0 thickness will not be seen. So you just want to make sure that that is actually checked before you draw lines with a 0 thickness, because lines with 0 thickness are not actually visible in the actual renderer. Then I'm not going to close my lines entirely. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close them using the tape tool. What we're going to do with the tape tool is we're going to click on Join Vectors and Smooth. Smooth is not as important in this case, but smooth is very useful your inking. But if I join the vectors, it will make sure that my lines will automatically fill correctly. I'm time-lapsing the inking of the dust because it is rather laborious. I've used a larger than 0 brush to ink with, and then made the lines into a 0 thickness afterwards by using the selection tool. The reason for this is it's far easier to work with lines which are larger than 0 when you are drawing. I have also decided to time-lapse through the inking, which is also a rather straightforward but laborious process. So now I'm going to add a couple of effects to make the puff of dust a little bit more interesting. So I'm just going to hide my rough line work. I'm just going to open the schematic. And I'm going to go to the effects. Just move the rough out of the way. What I'm going to add first is I'm going to add a blur. Just do a test render. And then I'm just going to increase this blur a little bit. I'm going to be doing a layered effect. This blur is essentially going to be the background. I want to retain a kind of cartoon feel to this puff of dust. I could get it to look a little bit more gritty and realistic, but I'm going to layer it to have it remain more cartoony. Really, you don't need to do much more than this. This would give you a dust effect. Just put it 12 frames per second. That will give you a basic dust effect, but I want it a bit more interesting than that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to distort this by adding some Perlin noise. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get another blur. And I'm going to lay them over each other. Just going to make this slightly less blurred, which will bring back my more cartoony feel. But I want to break up the top blur a bit more. So what I'm going to do with it is I'm just going to disconnect this blur for the moment, and what I'm going to add is a noise effect, which is the dissolve. We just put in the dissolve by itself. You'll see that the dissolve gives a bit of a speckled noise. It eats away from the original drawing. It's not a particularly smooth effect, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass that through the blur, which will give it a slightly softer feel. And if we overlay those, I should have a slightly more cartoony feel. But with just a little bit more texture to the dust. Then if I want to add a little bit more emphasis, I can go to layer blending and add one of the layer blending options. Generally I will go with multiply. Multiply will give us a slightly more intense feel to the blending. And see how that looks. There we have a very basic, quick and nasty dust effect.